All right. So, I was told that people that do not like free speech are concentrated mostly in this area of Seattle. So, this is supposedly an Antifa hotbed, and let's see if they want to assault a candidate again tonight. So, currently on giving you my coordinates here. We're on. I'm at the intersection of Virginia Street and 4th Avenue, I think. Is that correct? Yeah. So I'm told this is where the Antifa like to hang out. So the Bugmen are apparently out. These are their nests. So let's talk to people about Jewish supremacist control of this government and how I, in Washington, would put an end to their the rat-like claws grip over our government. So the assailants broke my recording gear last night, so I'm using Sans microphone this time, so you'll have to forgive me here if it's hard to hear me at times. Oh, good afternoon, sir. My name's Patrick Little.
Hi.
I'm running for president in 2020. Would you like to hear some of my proposals?
Sure.
So, what do you think of our current support for the state of Israel?
Very mixed and complicated issue.
Well, is the genocide happening against the Palestinians complicated? They are driving them from their land and killing them when they try and return. Okay, now, are you aware that the Israelis sterilize Africans if they want to stay in Israel? They force them to take birth control. If they don't take it, they make the Ethiopian Jews leave.
Did not know that.
Pretty amazing, right? Now, we send billions of dollars in aid a year to Israel, right? Now, what if I were to tell you that before the Civil War, less than 1% of European-descended whites owned slaves, but 40% of Jews owned slaves? And I also then said, if I were elected president, I would take the money we give to Israel and give it as reparations to African Americans descended of slaves. Be pretty interesting. Now, I just finished running up a senatorial campaign in California against Feinstein. I beat 20 candidates, but 11 beat me. I'm doing a cross-country tour right now. My cameraman and I were assaulted by Antifa last night because of our reparations for Africans at the expense of Israel proposal. Yeah, he wound up getting a concussion, and they broke my good recording gear, and he's recovering right now. He can't sustain another blow to the head, so he's not following me with the microphone in the boon tonight. So what if I were to tell you that 85% of the government of the Soviet Union at the time of the greatest genocide in history was comprised of a certain ethnic group? Now, in the 1920s and 1930s, communists kill around 30 million Christian Europeans. One of these great genocides during this time is called the Holodomor, where 11 to 20 million Ukrainian, mostly women and children, were starved to death intentionally by the Soviet government. At the time of this great crime against humanity, can you guess what percentage of the Soviet government was ethnically Jewish?
I would have no idea.
85%. Now, this is from the Jewish World Encyclopedia. Mind-blowing, right? Never heard this in school, did you? Do you think that what I'm saying is not the truth?
I definitely would want to follow up on that.
Well, I can give you the source where I got that information. It's called the Jewish World Encyclopedia. You can get it in pretty much any synagogue. I recommend the versions prior to 1960, where they still had this information in them. Now, do you know the leader of the Red Army? His name was Trotsky, right? Wrong. You know what his real name was? Well, I'll give you a hint. Can you guess what city he came from before the revolution, where he lived? New York. He was a tailor. You know what his real last name was at birth? Bronstein. Interesting facts, right? Now, I'm going to give you a hint here. There's a country that stole 400 to 600 kilograms of weapons-grade uranium from the United States in the early 1960s. They created what's called a Superfund site. Are you familiar with environmental cleanup projects?
Not very many, no.
When there's a huge nuclear spill, when there's a big chemical waste plant that spills and pollutes a bunch of land where it's unusable, they create a Superfund site. The government sets aside a bunch of money to clean it up in the future and tries to gain enough money to do the cleanup eventually. Now, Israel did such a sloppy job. That was a country that stole the 400 to 600 pounds of weapons-grade uranium from the NUMEC facility in Pennsylvania. They did such a sloppy job stealing our weapons-grade uranium that they polluted about a dozen acres, I believe, in southern Pennsylvania. Was it southern Pennsylvania, the NUMEC facility? Look that up for me there. So you would think, what would happen if North Korea had stolen 400 to 600 pounds of weapons-grade uranium before they had nuclear weapons? We probably would have gone house on them, right?
Possibility, just depends.
Pretty good possibility. Okay. What if I were to tell you in the 1960s, 1967, June exactly, there was a U.S. naval vessel and it was attacked by a certain country. The name of the ship was the USS Liberty. There were over 200 casualties. And that same year, I believe, quadrupled the aid budget to Israel that year. Can you guess which country attacked the USS Liberty, inflicting over 200 casualties? It was Israel. Can you guess what they did before they started attacking the USS Liberty? They jammed all of the distress frequencies. They jammed all of the secret and plain text radio communication channels that could have reached the Sixth Fleet. However, they put out a call on a non-standard channel, and that made it to the Sixth Fleet, at which point they were getting ready to dispatch jets to shoot down the Israeli fighter bombers that were attacking the USS Liberty. You would think we would cut off aid to Israel after they tried to false flag us like that. Would you like to hear the recordings of the pilots in Hebrew stating that they are about to attack an American ship, confirming to the control tower that it was an American ship and not an Egyptian ship that they were attacking?
I think this is very interesting that this is a topic you focus on.
Well, I'd like to focus on this because can you guess what the biggest lobby in Washington, D.C. is? The Israeli lobby, AIPAC, where I protested this spring. Interesting, right? Now, can you guess what ethnicity the top 5 donors to both the current President Trump and Hillary Clinton were? Can you guess their ethnicity? Jewish. Zionist Jews, to be exact. Among them are Sheldon Adelson and a few others. Now, can you name a single major news company that is not controlled by Jews?
No.
Maybe you want to guess Fox News?
Sure, Fox News.
Wrong. Orthodox Jews, the Murdochs, are all Orthodox Jews. Maybe CNN? Nope. Zucker, Zionist Jew. Damn. Maybe the New York Times. Nope. The Hoch-Sulzberger family. Do you know what all of these channels and stations have in common? They all said there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq prior to our invasion of Iraq, which cost millions of lives of innocent Iraqi civilians and U.S. troops together combined, including the sanctions leading up to the unjustified invasion. Millions of lives. Do you know who provided the intelligence to the United States and Tony Blair in Great Britain and George W. Bush, smart as he was? Do you know who provided them that intelligence? The Mossad. Do you know what country the Mossad is the intelligence agency for? Israel. Do you know what their motto is translated into English? So, for example, the Marine Corps is fighting military branch, and it has a motto, Semper Fidelis, always faithful. So the Mossad also has a slogan. Do you know what it is? Their official slogan.
No, I don't.
By deception we wage war. Pretty crazy, right? America's greatest ally that wages deception by war. How many Israeli troops were there in Iraq?
No idea.
Well, the only ones that I know from veterans, and I'm a Marine Corps veteran of Afghanistan, the only Israelis in Iraq were the ones that were shooting U.S. troops pretending to be Iraqi snipers. Pretending to be Syrian snipers. I misspoke there. So yes, there were Israeli troops in Iraq, but they were pretending to be Syrian snipers, shooting U.S. troops. Yeah. So let's talk maybe what are some issues that concern you in present day America? Maybe fairness in academic admissions?
I think being able to have affordable healthcare is one of our biggest.
Well, that's interesting. So do you think the people abusing prescription medications and prescription opiates is a major issue that drives up costs and associated with insurance and stuff?
I think it plays a factor into it. I don't think it's necessarily the one that really is driving up like the cost at this point.
So maybe a lack of focus on holistic prevention, preventive medicine, as opposed to chemotherapy, pharmaceuticals. So treating symptoms as opposed to preventing sicknesses.
Well, I think it has to do also with the affordability of it. So, I mean, you can have all of that, but if you can't be able to afford it, or feel like that you have the ability to go see a provider because of the financial hardship that many Americans are in at this point, it's kind of a really difficult situation.
I identify with that. My cameraman, when he was assaulted the other night, he got a concussion. He didn't have insurance. His medical expenses are out of pocket for me, because I said on the way to the hospital that I'd pay his expenses. It's a pretty big cost. I don't know what the bill's going to be yet, but it'll come in the mail.
It'll come in the mail.
It's going to be big, though. Now, I can tell you one of the most expensive aspects of our current insurance scheme is the way that private corporations are enriching themselves off from these massive prices that people are paying for pharmaceuticals, right? Now, you realize I could go to the doctor, I could go to the VA, for example. I'm a veteran. I sustained injury in the Marine Corps, so I have a disability. I can go to the VA hospital and say, I've got an owie. And with zero deductible, if I just tell them my pain scale out of 10 is like a 5 or higher, I'd qualify for pretty much heroin and a pill. You know, these Percocets, these codeines, these, what are they, Oxycontins, oxycodons, you name it. So, my point here is that the cost of these pills isn't the $1 a piece you'd be paying in the copay as a private citizen with private insurance. The cost is much higher than that. There's a social cost. Now, if you were to guess the largest pain pill company in this country in terms of people that produce these opium pills, these opiate pills, would you care to guess which company that is?
I don't know which one it is.
Purdue Pharma. Sounds like a nice Anglo-Saxon name, right? Do you know who owns it?
No.
Their name isn't Purdue. This is the Sackler family. It's a privately held corporation, not even a publicly traded one. They are Zionist Jews. Do you know that the pain pill industry is tightly regulated in industry? Guess what one of the top research facilities in Israel is named?
No idea.
The Sackler Institute in Israel, where they're using profits from selling drugs to Americans from behind lab coats to build medical facilities in Israel. So they're poisoning our people to take the drug money to fund projects in Israel. Now, what if I were to tell you the legacy of Zionist drug trade goes back far? Have you ever heard of the opium wars in China?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know who controlled the opium trade prior to those wars? And after? It was one family. One family. Their name was the Sassoon family. Sounds like a nice French family, right?
Guess not.
They weren't French. No. They were Jewish. And they were good friends with Baron Rothschild. Anyhow, the important thing to remember here is that the Chinese threw their own version of a tea party. They didn't like the trade that they were involved in with the British. They were selling off silk and all sorts of real wealth in exchange for all this opium that was coming in from Afghanistan that the Sassoon merchants were bringing in. And so they said, you know what? We liked that American Tea Party they threw where they didn't like the trade deal they had set up with Britain and the tax scheme. So we're going to do what they did, and we're going to dump all of the chests of the stuff we don't want into the rivers like the Yangtze River and into the ports, the waters of the ocean ports they had in China. Well, the Rothschilds and the Sassoons, Zionist Jews, did not like this one bit, and they went to the crown and said, we're not loaning you any more money for wars against France or your other neighbors unless you use your fleet to demolish the ports that block our entry into the trading rivers of China and force the unconditional surrender of the Chinese emperor. He will sign, and he did sign, an unconditional surrender in which he agrees to pay reparations not to the British government for the cost of war, but rather to the Sassoon family. Do you know what drug that was? It was opium. You realize if you were to just give one of these people addicted to these opioid pills just straight opium, they wouldn't have withdrawal. It's opium in a pill. The drug dealer's a guy in a lab coat. It's a very high cost. So we have about 40,000 deaths a year in this country from opiates, although I think the indirect causes of death get that probably to closer to 150, 200,000 when people go out and kill and steal and stuff, things that cause murder in order to get the money for these drugs. So I'm starting to paint a little bit of a picture here for you. Now, what if I were to tell you that there is an ethnicity in this country that makes up less than 2% of the population? Can you guess this? You might guess who I'm talking about here. I'm talking about Jews, of course. They make up less than 2% of the US population. But can you guess what percentage of the student body of Harvard grad school they are? So at 100 people, so randomly select 100 people from Harvard Graduate School. Guess how many of that 100 would be Jewish?
Upwards of about 50.
67. Well, you know what the interesting fact here is? I keep on reading articles in the newspapers how Harvard is a white supremacist school. Now, that's funny, and this begs a later question, but do you know what percentage of non-Jewish whites or European-blooded people were top-performing high school students in 2017? There are a few different ways of measuring this. According to one report that measured by one type of score, it was 65%. According to another, it was 70%. So European-blooded Americans, so white people, not including Jews, made up about 70% of top-performing high school students in 2017. Guess what percentage of the incoming freshman class for Harvard undergraduate white people were non-Jews? 70%, 65% of top-performing high school students. You're going to say at least 50%, right?
I mean, if you're already at like 67%, it's not long.
Well, that's the graduate school. That's the graduate school. I'm talking about the undergraduate school now. Two different things. So graduate school, 67% Jews at Harvard. So whites, you'd say the incoming class should be about, 70% white if they're 70% of top-performing high school students?
It's not a direct correlation,
But it's a pretty good correlation, you'd say. If whites are 70% of top-performing high school students, or 65 if you want to be conservative, you would think they're going to be more than a third of the freshman class at Harvard, right? I mean, at least half proportional representation, right?
I wouldn't necessarily say that.
Well, what?
I would say about 25%.
Okay, lower. What percentage of the incoming class at Harvard was ethnically European or white, non-Jewish, in 2017?
I'm going to say 15.
Nope. Lower.
Less than 10%.
More.
12.
Bam. 12%. The incoming class at Harvard, undergrad, freshman class, was only 12% white or ethnically European non-Jewish, despite whites having been 65 to 70% of top-performing high school students that same year. So ask yourself, let's do some fractions here. What is 2% divided by 67%? About 35, right? 34 point something, 35, right? So 2% of the population, which they're only 1.7, we're going to round up to 2. 67%. So that's about 35 is the ratio, right? Now, let's divide 12 by 70. Compare those two numbers. Jews were about 6,000% overrepresented compared to whites at Harvard University. No, 7,200%. Do the math, guys. So, is Harvard a white supremacist school or a Jewish supremacist school? And by the way, do you know where I got the figure on 67% of the Harvard grad school being ethnically Jewish? Hillel, 2017 guide for the best schools for Jews in the United States. You know Hillel? Hillel is a top Jewish student organization in the country in terms of membership and dues paid. Is your mind blown yet? Are you seeing white supremacism or Jewish supremacism here? What if I were to tell you that over 50% of the 1% in this country were ethnically Jewish, despite Jews being 1.7% of the country, and that only around 30% of the top 1% in this country was ethnically white, despite being about 65, 63% of the country now. That's pretty crazy, right? So you want to do some proportions and compare the overrepresentation with me? Well, do the numbers, sir. Jews are what percentage overrepresented in the 1% compared to whites? A lot. Now, what percentage of billionaires in the world do you think are ethnically Jewish?
What percent of them?
That's homework for you. My name's Patrick Little. I'd like equal standards for admission into colleges in the United States. I'd like to end aid to Israel. I'd like reparations for African Americans, and I'd like to end Jewish supremacy both at our State Department and in our Congress. What do you think? Can I count on your vote in 2020?
Yeah, definitely consider it.
All right, Pat at littlerevolution.us. If you have any questions, if anything I've said here isn't true, let me know, and be sure to tell the world, because everything I'm saying here, almost all of it, is coming from Jewish sources. Oh, did I tell you what percentage of Jews in this country owned African slaves before the Civil War? This is according to the Jewish World Encyclopedia.
No idea.
You want to guess, out of 100, how many of them would own slaves on average, statistically?
I have heard nothing about that.
40 out of 100, 40%. You know what percentage of non-Jewish whites owned slaves in this country before the Civil War?
Guessing less than
0.8%. Now that means Jews per capita were 50 times more likely to own slaves on their personal properties before the Civil War. That's only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the historic prevalence of Jews in the slave trade. Do you know who the Roman historian Tacitus, shortly before 200 AD, said controlled the slave trades from Gaul to Britain to Morocco to Syria to Pontus, which is like the southern tip of Russia? Can you guess who he said controlled the slave trades and followed the Roman legions, begging the legionary commanders to take more captives and to sell them to the Jews at a... Oh, I just gave it away. It was Jews. Yeah. Tacitus. So this is about... You think that's the end of it, right? Do you know who ran the slave trades in Egypt?
Jewish people.
Ding, 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 ding. We've got some more questions for you. Who controlled the slave trade, the African slave trade in North Africa, prior to when the British abolished slavery globally outside of America?
I'm going to guess Jews.
Yep, ding, ding, ding. The largest slave trade in the world for African slaves was in what country?
Israel.
Nope. It wasn't called Israel then, it was called Palestine. But, nope, Brazil. Guy named Lopez. Right? Sounds pretty Spanish, right? You want to guess what faith that guy was?
Jewish.
Ding, ding, ding. A Marrano Jew. Pretended to convert to Catholicism. Family was Jewish. They were based out of New Haven, Connecticut. The first synagogue in this country was in which city in this country? I'll give you a hint. It was the early transport hub for African slaves in this country. New Haven, Connecticut. First slave market in this country, also the first synagogue. You know who else says these facts? Minister Louis Farrakhan. Don't hear much nice stuff about him in the news, do you?
I have no idea who it is.
He's not. They don't paint him very nice in the media. Now, one last one for you. Do you know who controlled the white slave trade of Irish girls who were stolen by pirates from the coast of Ireland, and Icelandic girls stolen from the coast of Iceland, and French girls stolen from the ports of France? The small fishing villages of France, and also the Slavic women stolen from around the Black Sea down in Ukraine and places like southern Russia and stuff. You want to guess who controlled those slave markets of white women? And I'll give you a hint. You can read a book called White Gold if you want to figure this out. Do you know who controlled the white slave markets at the same time as the peak of the African slave trade in North Africa and the Middle East?
Actually, not the magician.
Bing, 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 bing. Both whites and blacks know the crack of the Jewish whip historically, going back thousands of years. But have you ever seen the movie Amistad by Steven Spielberg? Can you guess what iconography? How do you say it? Iconography? Icons? Can you guess what icons are used religiously in the movie Amistad, which is like the movie to watch for slavery. Like if you're gonna watch a movie about an African slave ship, about slavery, there's one movie, it's Amistad. Can you guess what religious symbol all of the crew members and all of the slavers at the markets are wearing? It's not the Star of David. They're all wearing crucifixes. There are big statues of Jesus on the ships, on the slave ship, and in the slave markets, and everywhere. Well, guess who controlled almost every single big slave ship during the triangular trade between the Caribbean, Europe and Africa, and the United States? Jews. But guess who controls Hollywood? Guess who is, 10,000% overrepresented compared to whites in Hollywood producers and editors and directors? Boom! Steven Spielberg, who produced Amistad and made it look like the slave trade was entirely Christian, was
Jewish.
Boom! Guess what other movie he produced?
I don't know which one you're gonna say.
Schindler's List. You know what's funny about Schindler's List?
Nope.
Right before World War II, the largest Holocaust in history happened. The largest, genocide in history. The term Holocaust wasn't coined until the late 60s, by the way. The largest, it wasn't coined a term with the Jewish experience during World War II until the 1960s, and you can look that up by looking at Encyclopedia Britannica, the term Holocaust. It means burnt offering prior to the early 1960s. It didn't refer to anything about Jews prior to that. 11 to 20 million European Christians were killed in the Ukraine. 11 to 20 million. Now, let's assume the middle there is like 18 million, right? Or 15 million. That's about 3 times as many as 6 million, right? How many weeks did you spend studying Holocaust stuff growing up in elementary school, middle school, high school, college? A lot. If you added all those weeks together where you were doing course material related to the Holocaust, I'd say it's probably, assuming it's just one of the subjects or more, that it's teaching that subject matter at a time. I'd say I probably had about 5 years of Holocaust education. If you put together all the different times we were dealing with Holocaust-related material, think about it. There's a Holocaust month every year from elementary school to middle school. I think high school too. But I know elementary school and middle school and junior high all do the Holocaust month every year, right? So that adds up to, you have 12 classes for the end of high school. That ends up being about a year. Plus, how many times in your AP English class did you have to read about roller coasters of death that ended in ovens and stuff? So I did the math with someone, and it's several years worth of time you spend in school where you're taking a course where they're teaching about the Holocaust. Now, just by historical admission, the Holodomor, which happened within 10 years of the World War II, was 3 times as many people killed in an intentional genocide as the number claimed, the 6 million number, during World War II. How many times did you learn about the Holodomor, which was 3 times as big as what they claim the number is for the Holocaust? You ever heard of it before? Never heard of it. You know what percentage of the government was ethnically Jewish during the Holodomor? 85%. Do you know what percentage of the Gulag guards prior to World War II in the Soviet Union were ethnically Jewish?
No idea.
That's homework for you. I want you to look up Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He wrote this number. It's a percentage. It's pretty much the same as the last one I quoted you in terms of the number, the percentage of the government of the Soviet Union being ethnically Jewish. Solzhenitsyn, he wrote Gulag Archipelago and 200 Years Together, describing Jewish tyranny in the Soviet Union. So I've laid a pretty big pile of info for you tonight. There's one film I want you to watch walking away from this tonight. You know what that is? It's called The Greatest Story Never Told. You want to take a look at that maybe when you get home?
What's it about?
It's about the most scapegoated people in history. You're not going to believe it. Just take a look when you get home. If you don't like it, try The Culture of Critique instead, the 1-hour summary. But The Greatest Story Never Told. You'll never go back once you watch that. These people have been scapegoated more than any other people in history. And it's currently illegal in this country to question certain historical narratives. You want to consider just Googling The Greatest Story Never Told at some point?
I would consider that.
All right, he's considering watching The Greatest Story Never Told. Vote Little, Win Big 2020. Thank you. All right, so it's a shame my cameraman isn't here. Okay, the commies found me. I gotta go. Looks like they're trying to put me in the hospital again. So we are going to get going before Antifa gets here because I'm here solo. I'm in downtown Portland, and I'm wishing you all a good night. Don't let the Jew bugs bite.